The Secret Library. Part 1, The Restless Heart. Oliver lived in a small town where life felt like it was always standing still. The streets were lined with the same old shops, and the same faces passed by every day. He worked at the bakery on Main Street, kneading dough, glazing pastries, and listening to customers chat about their travels. Oliver wasn't unhappy, but he wasn't excited either. Every morning, he woke up to the same smells of fresh bread and sugar. Every night, he stared out of the window in his tiny room, looking at the stars and wondering what lay beyond his quiet world. "I wish I could live a life like theirs," he would say, watching travelers passing through town with backpacks and maps. They looked so alive, full of stories and adventures he couldn't imagine. One gray afternoon, when the rain had emptied the streets, Oliver decided to take a walk. He left the bakery and wandered through the quieter parts of town, where narrow alleys twisted and turned. He wasn't sure where he was going. He just wanted to escape the stillness of his thoughts. As he turned a corner, he saw something unusual. Between two large buildings, a small shop stood tucked away, as if it had been hiding there all along. The sign above the door read "The Dusty Tome," its letters faded and cracked. Curious, Oliver pushed the door open. A bell tinkled softly, and a wave of warmth hit him. The shop was dimly lit, its shelves crammed with books of every size and color. Dust hung in the air, catching the soft glow of a single lamp. "Looking for something special?" a voice said. Oliver turned and saw an old man sitting behind the counter. He had a kind face and wore glasses that made his eyes look large and round. "I don't know," Oliver admitted. "I just feel like something's missing." The old man smiled and stood up. He walked slowly to a shelf behind the counter and pulled out a small book. Its leather cover was plain with no title or decoration. "This might be what you're looking for," the man said, placing it gently in Oliver's hands. Oliver opened the book. The pages were blank. "There's nothing in it," he said, confused. "Not yet," the man replied, "but it will lead you to the secret library. There you'll find everything you've been looking for." Before Oliver could ask what he meant, the man gestured toward the book. "Go on, open it." Hesitant, Oliver turned the first blank page. A soft golden light spilled out, growing brighter and brighter until it filled the room. Oliver shut his eyes against the glow, and when he opened them, he was no longer in the shop. Part 2, The Secret Library. When Oliver opened his eyes, he gasped. He was no longer in the dim little bookshop. Instead, he stood in a vast, glowing hall filled with shelves of books that stretched higher than he could see. The air was warm and still, and faint lights, like golden fireflies, floated lazily between the rows of shelves. The library was quiet, but not in an empty way. It was the kind of quiet that hummed with possibility, as though the walls themselves were alive with stories waiting to be told. Oliver took a few hesitant steps forward, his boots clicking softly on the polished floor. The floor itself seemed to shimmer, like the surface of a still pond catching the light. "Hello?" Oliver called, his voice echoing faintly. "Is anyone here?" As if in answer, one of the floating lights drifted toward him. It hovered in front of his face, pulsing gently like it was breathing. Then, slowly, it floated down a nearby aisle, bobbing as if it wanted him to follow. Oliver hesitated for a moment, then shrugged. "Why not?" he muttered. "It's not like I know where I am anyway." He followed the light down the aisle, past shelves packed with books of every size and color. Some books had covers that shimmered like jewels. Others were plain and worn, their spines cracked with age. One book was so large that it took up an entire shelf, while another was no bigger than the palm of his hand. Each book seemed to hum faintly, as though it were alive. At the end of the aisle, the floating light stopped in front of a desk. Sitting behind the desk was a woman with long, silver hair and a cloak that seemed to shift colors in the light. She looked up and smiled warmly. "Welcome," she said. Her voice was soft but carried a sense of calm authority, like she had been waiting for him. "Where am I?" Oliver asked, his voice trembling slightly. "This is the secret library," the woman replied. "It's a place where stories come to life." Oliver stared at her. "Come to life? What does that mean?" The woman stood and walked around the desk, gesturing to the shelves around them. "Every book in this library holds a story," she said. "But these are not ordinary stories. When you open a book here, you don't just read the story, you live it. You become part of it, experiencing the life of its characters as if it were your own." Oliver's eyes widened. "I can live someone else's life?" The woman nodded. "Yes, but be warned. You cannot skip ahead or stop the story once it begins. You must live it fully, with all its joys and challenges." Oliver felt a spark of excitement. He had always dreamed of escaping his own boring life, of living the adventures he read about in books. Now, it seemed, he had the chance to do exactly that. "Can I try one?" he asked eagerly. The woman smiled again. "Of course, the library is here for those who seek it, but remember, not every life is as it seems." Oliver nodded, hardly listening. He was too busy scanning the shelves, looking for the perfect book. His eyes landed on a thick, leather-bound volume with a golden crest embossed on the cover. The title read, "The Knight's Quest." "This one," he said, pulling the book from the shelf. The woman's expression softened. "A noble choice. Open it, and your adventure will begin." Oliver opened the book. As soon as he turned the first page, a bright light surrounded him, growing stronger until the library faded away. For a moment, he felt weightless, like he was floating in a dream. Then, slowly, the light faded, and he found himself standing in a very different place. Part 3. The Life of a Knight. When the light faded, Oliver found himself standing in a grand hall. The ceiling stretched high above, supported by tall stone columns adorned with banners of red and gold. A long table ran down the center of the hall, laden with steaming platters of food and goblets of wine. People in fine robes and shining armor filled the room, laughing and cheering. Oliver looked down at himself. He was wearing gleaming silver armor, and a sword hung at his side. The armor fit perfectly, as though it had been made just for him. "Sir Oliver," a deep voice called. Oliver turned to see a broad-shouldered man with a thick beard striding toward him. He clapped Oliver on the shoulder, nearly knocking him off balance. "You're the pride of the kingdom," the man boomed. "Tomorrow, you'll slay the dragon and save us all." Oliver's eyes widened. The man laughed. "Don't tell me you're nervous. You faced countless battles and never faltered. The people believe in you, Sir Oliver." Oliver managed a weak smile. "They think I'm some sort of hero," he thought. "I guess I'll have to play along." The next morning, Oliver was awoken by a trumpet blast. He was escorted to the castle gates, where a crowd of villagers had gathered to see him off. Children waved flowers, and an old woman blessed him with a prayer for safety. "You've got this," Oliver muttered to himself as he mounted a white horse. The saddle felt unfamiliar, and he struggled to keep his balance as the horse trotted forward. He wasn't sure how to ride, but the horse seemed to know what to do. The journey to the dragon's lair was long and treacherous. Oliver rode through dense forests where the sunlight barely reached the ground. He crossed narrow bridges over rushing rivers and climbed steep, rocky trails. Each step of the way, he wondered what he had gotten himself into. By midday, Oliver reached the edge of a dark, misty forest. This was where the dragon's lair was said to be. He tied his horse to a tree and unsheathed his sword, which felt heavier than he expected. His armor clinked with every step as he walked into the forest. The deeper he went, the darker it became. The air was thick with smoke, and the ground was littered with scorched branches. Oliver's heart pounded as he heard the sound of heavy breathing up ahead. The forest opened into a wide clearing, and there it was, the dragon. It was enormous, with scales that glinted like black diamonds and eyes that burned like molten gold. Smoke curled from its nostrils and its tail thumped against the ground, leaving deep gouges in the earth. Oliver froze. He had imagined dragons before, majestic, mythical creatures from the pages of books, but seeing one in real life was entirely different. This dragon wasn't just big, it was terrifying. The dragon's head snapped toward him, and it let out a deafening roar. The force of it knocked Oliver backward, and he barely managed to stay on his feet. His sword trembled in his hands. What am I doing here, Oliver thought. I can't fight a dragon. The dragon lunged, and Oliver dove to the side, narrowly avoiding its massive claws. He scrambled to his feet and swung his sword, but it glanced off the dragon's thick scales without leaving a mark. The battle raged on. Oliver dodged and rolled, his armor clanking loudly with every move. The dragon's fiery breath singed his cloak, and its tail whipped past him, knocking down trees like they were twigs. As the fight dragged on, Oliver's arms grew tired and his legs ached from running. He realized that brute force wasn't going to win this battle. He needed to outthink the dragon. Oliver noticed the dragon's movements were slower whenever it turned its head. Its massive body made it clumsy when it had to change direction quickly. An idea began to form in his mind. He ran toward a cluster of large boulders at the edge of the clearing, weaving back and forth to avoid the dragon's claws. When he reached the boulders, he ducked behind them, forcing the dragon to twist its body to reach him. The dragon lunged, and Oliver darted to another boulder. The dragon growled in frustration, turning again to follow him. Oliver repeated the move, leading the dragon in a tight circle around the rocks. The beast's massive body became tangled in its own tail, and it stumbled, roaring in frustration. Seizing the opportunity, Oliver grabbed a nearby net, a tool left behind by a previous adventurer perhaps, and threw it over the dragon's head. The net caught on the dragon's horns, and it thrashed wildly, trying to free itself. Oliver stepped forward, sword in hand, but he hesitated. The dragon's golden eyes stared at him, not with anger, but with fear. He realized it wasn't just a monster, it was a living creature, trying to protect its home. Instead of striking the final blow, Oliver sheathed his sword and stepped back. "You're free to go," he said softly. The dragon stopped thrashing. For a moment, it simply stared at him. Then, with a final huff of smoke, it turned and lumbered into the forest, disappearing into the mist. When Oliver returned to the castle, the crowd erupted into cheers. The nobles praised his bravery, and a bard composed a song in his honor. But Oliver felt different. The cheers and feasting didn't excite him the way he thought they would. Later, as he sat alone in the grand hall, Oliver thought about the dragon. He had dreamed of being a knight, of living a life of glory and adventure. But now he understood that being a knight wasn't just about the excitement. It was about courage, kindness, and doing what was right, even when no one was watching. When the bright light of the library surrounded him again, Oliver felt relieved. He was ready for his next story. Part 4, The Life of an Explorer. As the light faded, Oliver felt a salty breeze against his face. He opened his eyes to find himself standing on the deck of a grand ship. The sails billowed in the wind, and the wood beneath his feet creaked as the ship rocked gently on the waves. The ocean stretched endlessly in every direction, glittering under the bright sun. "Captain Oliver!" a voice called. Oliver turned to see a crew of sailors looking at him with expectant smiles. They were dressed in simple, rugged clothes, their faces tanned and weathered from long days at sea. "Captain?" Oliver echoed, confused. A wiry man with a red bandana stepped forward, grinning. "That's right, Captain. You've led us through storms and uncharted waters, and now we're about to reach the most mysterious island in the world." Oliver's heart raced. He had always dreamed of being an explorer, venturing into the unknown and discovering hidden treasures. But leading an entire crew, that was a surprise. Right," Oliver said, trying to sound confident. "Let's keep going." The crew cheered, and Oliver tried to act as though he knew what he was doing. As the ship sailed toward the distant horizon, he marveled at the sense of freedom. The open sea felt alive, the waves rolling and shimmering like a living creature. By late afternoon, the crew spotted land, a lush green island rising out of the water like an emerald crown. Birds circled above, their cries echoing across the waves. The sailors scrambled to lower the anchor and prepare the rowboats. "Captain, what do you think we'll find?" asked a young sailor with wide eyes. Oliver hesitated, unsure how to answer. "Whatever it is," he said at last, "it'll be something no one's ever seen before." The rowboats hit the shore with a soft thud, and the crew jumped out, pulling them onto the sand. The beach was beautiful, with white sand that sparkled in the sunlight. Strange plants grew along the edge of the jungle, their leaves shimmering faintly, as though they were made of glass. "Spread out," Oliver instructed, remembering how captains always seem to take charge in stories. "Look for anything unusual, but stay close." As the crew began exploring, Oliver wandered toward the jungle. The air was thick and humid, and the sounds of chirping insects and rustling leaves filled his ears. He pushed through vines and ferns, feeling a mix of excitement and unease. After hours of searching, Oliver stumbled upon something extraordinary. Deep in the jungle, hidden beneath layers of moss and vines, was a stone structure. It looked like a temple, with carvings covering its weathered walls. The carvings depicted strange creatures and symbols, their meanings lost to time. "Captain!" the crew shouted as they caught up to him. "You found it!" The sailors gathered around, their eyes wide with wonder. One of them brushed away the moss covering a carving, revealing a figure holding a glowing orb. "It's a map!" the sailor exclaimed, pointing to the symbols. "Look, it's showing us where to find the treasure!" Oliver squinted at the carvings. They did seem to form a path, leading deeper into the jungle. His heart raced with excitement. "Let's follow it," he said. The crew pressed on, using the map as a guide. The jungle grew darker and denser, the air heavy with the scent of earth and rain. Finally, they reached a clearing where a massive stone chest sat half buried in the ground. The crew cheered, and Oliver felt a surge of pride. "We did it," he said, stepping forward to open the chest. Inside they found not gold or jewels, but a collection of tools, seeds, and ancient scrolls. The crew's excitement dimmed, and one sailor muttered, "This isn't treasure." But as Oliver examined the contents, he realized the truth. The tools were finely crafted, the seeds carefully preserved, and the scrolls contained knowledge about farming and building. These weren't riches to hoard. They were gifts meant to help rebuild and thrive. "This is the real treasure," Oliver said, his voice steady. "It's not about riches, it's about creating something lasting." The crew exchanged uncertain glances, but they trusted their captain. Together, they gathered the items and began the journey back to the ship. The return voyage was not as smooth as the journey to the island. Dark clouds gathered on the horizon, and the wind howled through the sails. The waves grew higher and rougher, tossing the ship like a toy. "Captain," the sailor with the red bandana shouted, "what do we do?" Oliver gripped the wheel tightly, his heart pounding. He didn't know how to handle a storm, but he couldn't let the crew see his fear. "Tie down the cargo and lower the sails," he shouted, hoping he sounded confident. The sailors scrambled to follow his orders as the rain poured down in sheets. Lightning lit up the sky, and thunder roared like the dragon Oliver had faced in the last story. The ship creaked and groaned, but Oliver refused to give up. He steered the ship with all his strength, guiding it away from the sharp rocks jutting out of the waves. The storm raged on, but slowly the winds began to die down, and the sea grew calmer. When the clouds finally parted, the crew let out a cheer. "Captain Oliver," they cried, "you saved us." Exhausted but relieved, Oliver leaned against the wheel. He had never felt so alive, and so tired. When the ship reached the harbor, the crew began unloading their treasure. As they worked, Oliver noticed a faint golden light surrounding him. He knew what it meant. The librarian's voice echoed in his mind. "Every life has its joys and challenges. What did you learn?" Oliver thought about the storm, the treasure, and the crew who had trusted him. He realized that adventure wasn't just about excitement. It was about courage, teamwork, and finding meaning in the journey. As the golden light grew brighter, Oliver whispered, "I'm ready for the next story." Part 5, The Life of a Star. The golden light surrounded Oliver once more, lifting him off the deck of the ship. He felt weightless, as though he were floating on air. When the light faded, he opened his eyes and found himself standing on a stage. Bright lights shone down on him, and a crowd of thousands cheered, their voices echoing through the massive concert hall. Oliver glanced around. He was holding a shiny black microphone, and a sleek guitar was strapped across his chest. He was wearing a stylish jacket covered in shimmering sequins that reflected the lights like tiny stars. Behind him, a band waited with their instruments, grinning as if they had just finished the best performance of their lives. "Encore, encore," the crowd chanted, stomping their feet in rhythm. Oliver blinked, stunned. He had barely adjusted to being an explorer, and now he was a famous star? Thank you," he stammered into the microphone, his voice booming through the speakers. The band leader leaned over and whispered, "Hit them with the finale. You know, the one that makes the crowd go wild." Oliver's mind raced. He didn't know how to play guitar, at least not well, but the band was already counting him in. 1, 2, 3, 4, they shouted, launching into a powerful upbeat tune. Oliver panicked as his hands moved on their own, strumming the guitar strings perfectly. The music filled the hall, and the crowd roared with delight, clapping and singing along. Somehow, his body knew exactly what to do, even if his mind didn't. He started singing, his voice clear and strong. The lyrics flowed naturally, as though he had sung the song 1,000 times before. He couldn't help but feel a rush of excitement as the audience waved their hands and chanted his name. "Oliver! Oliver!" By the end of the song, the crowd was on its feet, cheering louder than ever. Oliver smiled and waved, soaking in the energy. This was the kind of attention he had always dreamed of. People loving him, admiring him, celebrating him. After the show, Oliver was whisked backstage, where a crowd of reporters and photographers waited. Flashbulbs popped and voices shouted questions. "Oliver, how do you write such amazing songs? Oliver, who inspires your music? Oliver, what's next for your career?" Oliver laughed nervously, pretending to be confident. "Oh, you know, it just comes to me," he said, though he had no idea how he had managed to pull off the performance. For the next few days, Oliver's life was a whirlwind. He attended fancy parties filled with celebrities and walked red carpets lined with fans and photographers. His face appeared on magazines and billboards, and people stopped him in the streets to ask for autographs. It was thrilling, but also exhausting. At first, Oliver loved the attention. People treated him like he was the most important person in the world. But as the days went on, he started to feel the pressure. Every time he stepped outside, cameras followed him. Every time he sat down to eat, someone interrupted him for a photo. He barely had a moment to himself. The worst part was the expectations. His manager, a sharp-dressed woman who always seemed to be on her phone, pushed him to write new songs and perform bigger shows. "Your fans are hungry for more," she said, handing him a packed schedule. "We can't let them down." Oliver tried to keep up, but it wasn't easy. Writing songs was harder than it looked, especially when he was so tired. Some nights he stayed up until dawn, staring at blank sheets of paper. Other nights he fell asleep in the middle of rehearsals, only to be woken up by his band. One night, after a long day of interviews and rehearsals, Oliver returned to his luxurious hotel suite. The room was enormous, with a view of the city skyline, but it felt empty. He sat on the edge of the bed, looking at the golden awards and fan letters scattered across the table. For the first time, he felt lonely. He thought about the people cheering for him, the fans who adored him. They saw him as a star, a larger-than-life figure who had everything. But no one really knew him. They didn't see how tired he was, how much he missed having quiet moments to himself. He sighed and picked up his guitar, strumming a few soft chords. The sound was soothing, and for the first time in days, he felt a little bit like himself. The next morning, Oliver's manager sent him to a small cafe for an exclusive interview. As he waited for the reporter to arrive, a young woman approached him. She wasn't holding a camera or a notebook, just a cup of coffee. "You look tired," she said simply. Oliver blinked, surprised. Most people gushed over him or begged for a selfie. "I've been busy," he admitted. The woman nodded and sat down across from him. "I saw your concert the other night. You were amazing." "Thanks," Oliver said, his smile faint. "But," she added, "you looked happiest when you weren't on stage. During the last song, when the band started playing and you just closed your eyes and played the guitar, that's when it felt real." Oliver stared at her, her words echoing in his mind. She was right. The happiest moment of the concert wasn't the cheers or the applause. It was the music itself, the simple joy of creating something beautiful. "Thanks," he said again, this time with more feeling. "I needed to hear that." That night, Oliver returned to the stage for another performance. But this time, he did something different. Instead of sticking to the flashy routine his manager had planned, he sat down on a stool with his guitar. The spotlight focused on him, and the crowd grew quiet. "This song is for everyone who feels like they have to be perfect all the time," he said. "It's for anyone who's ever been tired of pretending." Then he played a simple, heartfelt melody. The lyrics weren't about fame or glory. They were about finding peace and joy in the little things. As he sang, he felt a weight lifting off his shoulders. When the song ended, the crowd erupted into applause, but Oliver didn't feel overwhelmed this time. He felt calm, content. As the cheers faded, the golden light surrounded Oliver once more. The familiar hum of the library welcomed him back, and he found himself standing before the silver-haired librarian. "How was it?" she asked, her eyes twinkling. "Being a star is exciting," Oliver said, "but it's harder than I imagined. All the attention, the pressure, it's a lot. But I realized that the best part wasn't the fame, it was the music. That's what really made me happy." The librarian nodded. "Fame shines brightly, but it's the quiet moments that truly light the way." Oliver smiled. "I'm ready for the next story." Part 6, The Life of a Healer. As the golden light surrounded him, Oliver felt his body change again. When the light faded, he found himself standing in a small, cozy room filled with shelves of jars, bottles, and dried herbs. The air smelled of lavender and mint, with a faint hint of something earthy. A crackling fire warmed the space, and a worn wooden table sat in the center, cluttered with mortar and pestles, handwritten notes, and bundles of plants. "Dr. Oliver, there you are!" A young boy burst into the room, his cheeks red from the cold. "Mrs. Calder's coughing fit is worse. Can you come quickly?" Oliver blinked, startled. "Me? Yes, of course," he said, trying to sound confident. He grabbed a leather satchel from the table, though he had no idea what it contained. The boy tugged his sleeve, urging him outside. The village was small, with snow-dusted cottages clustered around a cobblestone square. Smoke curled from chimneys, and the air was crisp and cold. Villagers bustled about, their faces creased with worry as they whispered about Mrs. Calder. "Everyone's counting on you, Doctor," the boy said as they hurried through the square. Oliver's stomach churned. He wasn't a real healer. He barely knew the difference between parsley and poison ivy. But as they approached a small cottage with a crowd gathered outside, he reminded himself that this was part of the story. Somehow, he would have to figure it out. Inside the cottage, Mrs. Calder lay in bed, her face pale and her breaths shallow. Her husband sat beside her, clutching her hand, his eyes full of fear. "Thank goodness you're here," he said. "She's getting worse. Can you help her?" Oliver hesitated, his mind racing. He opened his satchel, revealing vials of colorful liquids and bundles of dried herbs. His fingers hovered over the items, unsure of what to do. Suddenly, a memory flickered in his mind, like a scene from a book he had read long ago. He remembered grinding dried thyme and honey into a paste for coughs. Hoping it would work, he picked up a mortar and pestle and began mixing the ingredients. "Here," he said, holding out the mixture. "This should help, just a small spoonful for now." Mrs. Calder's husband gave her the paste, and after a few tense moments, her breathing eased. The color returned to her cheeks, and the room filled with relieved sighs. "You've done it again, doctor," someone said. "You always know just what to do." Oliver smiled weakly. He wasn't sure how he had known, but he felt a warm sense of pride. It wasn't the applause of a crowd or the cheers of a crew, but it was enough. Over the next few days, Oliver found himself busier than he had expected. The villagers came to him with all kinds of ailments, aches, fevers, cuts, and bruises. Some problems were simple, like making a tea to calm someone's nerves. Others were harder, like setting a broken bone or stitching a deep wound. At first, Oliver felt overwhelmed. He wasn't used to people relying on him, and the responsibility weighed heavily on his shoulders. But as he worked, he began to notice something. Every act of care, no matter how small, made a difference. A boy's scraped knee healed with a simple salve. An elderly woman's headaches disappeared after a week of herbal tea. The villagers weren't just patients. They were people with stories and struggles. Oliver learned about the farmer who worked tirelessly to feed his family, the weaver who crafted beautiful tapestries despite her failing eyesight, and the baker who always gave away extra bread to those in need. Their gratitude warmed his heart in a way he hadn't felt before. One evening, after a long day of tending to the villagers, Oliver returned to his small cottage. He sank into a chair by the fire, exhaustion pulling at his limbs. His hands were stained with herbs, and his back ached from carrying supplies. As he stared into the flames, a knock came at the door. Oliver groaned inwardly, but stood to answer it. A young woman stood outside, cradling a crying toddler. "I'm so sorry to bother you, doctor," she said, her voice trembling. "But my son has a terrible fever, and I didn't know where else to go." Oliver nodded, forcing a smile. The hours passed in a blur as Oliver prepared compresses, brewed teas, and stayed by the child's side. It wasn't until dawn that the fever broke, and the toddler fell into a peaceful sleep. The mother's eyes filled with tears as she thanked him. When they left, Oliver collapsed onto his bed, too tired to even remove his boots. He realized that being a healer wasn't just about knowledge or skill. It was about giving, even when you had nothing left to give. One afternoon, as Oliver was organizing his shelves, a group of children burst into the room. "Dr. Oliver! Dr. Oliver!" they shouted, pulling him outside. In the square, the villagers had gathered, holding baskets of food and gifts. The baker handed him a loaf of fresh bread. The weaver draped a beautiful scarf around his shoulders. The farmer placed a sack of apples at his feet. "What's all this?" Oliver asked, bewildered. "It's for you," the young boy from before said. "You've done so much for us, and we wanted to thank you." Oliver felt a lump rise in his throat. He had spent so much time thinking of himself as just a helper, someone working quietly behind the scenes. But now he realized that in the eyes of the villagers, he was their hero. As Oliver walked back to his cottage, the familiar golden light surrounded him. He felt the warmth of the villagers' gratitude still lingering in his heart. Back in the library, the silver-haired librarian greeted him with her usual smile. "How was it?" "Different," Oliver said, his voice soft. "It wasn't about excitement or glory. It was about helping people, even in small ways, and it felt good." The librarian nodded. "There is strength in kindness, and sometimes the greatest heroes are the quietest ones." Oliver smiled, ready for whatever adventure came next. Part 7. The Life of a Lighthouse Keeper. As the golden light enveloped him, Oliver felt the familiar shift. When it faded, he found himself standing at the top of a tall lighthouse. The sound of crashing waves roared below, and the salty breeze whipped through his hair. The sky was painted in shades of gray, with heavy clouds rolling in from the horizon. The lighthouse stood perched on the edge of a rocky cliff, surrounded by the endless expanse of the ocean. Inside, the air was filled with the faint smell of oil and seaweed, and the steady hum of the lantern's mechanism echoed softly. Oliver glanced down at himself. He was wearing a thick coat and sturdy boots, the kind that could withstand the harsh wind and cold. His hands were calloused and rough, as though he had spent years maintaining the lighthouse. "Keeper Oliver," a voice called from below. Startled, Oliver leaned over the railing and saw a boy standing at the base of the spiral staircase. The boy held a bucket filled with coal and looked up expectantly. "Yes," Oliver replied, his voice uncertain. "The storm's coming fast," the boy said. "Make sure the light stays steady tonight. A ship's due to pass, and they'll need your guidance." Oliver nodded, his heart pounding. The boy disappeared, leaving Oliver alone with the responsibility of ensuring the lighthouse fulfilled its purpose. Oliver set to work, unsure of where to begin but relying on his instincts. He climbed down the winding staircase to the lighthouse's base, where a massive boiler roared softly. The machinery looked ancient but well maintained, its gears turning steadily to keep the light at the top spinning. He checked the oil levels, refilled the reservoir, and shoveled more coal into the furnace to keep the boiler running. The work was harder than he expected, and sweat soon trickled down his face despite the cold air. He wiped his brow and sighed, glancing at the massive journal that sat open on a nearby desk. The journal was filled with pages of careful entries, recording the ships that had passed and the weather conditions for each night. Oliver flipped through the pages, marveling at the years of dedication it must have taken to fill them. One entry caught his eye. March 14, storm rolled in late. A passing ship signaled their thanks before disappearing into the fog. Oliver stared at the words, a strange feeling rising in his chest. The keeper before him had worked tirelessly, never knowing the people he helped, but trusting that his work mattered. The days passed in a steady rhythm. Each morning, Oliver checked the machinery, cleaned the lantern, and polished the glass. By evening, he climbed to the top of the tower, lighting the massive flame that sent its guiding beam out to sea. At first, Oliver felt restless. The lighthouse was isolated, surrounded only by the roar of the ocean and the cries of seabirds. He missed the noise of the village, the warmth of human voices. At night, as he sat by the fire with a plate of simple food, the silence seemed to stretch endlessly. But over time, Oliver began to notice the quiet beauty of his surroundings. The sunrises painted the ocean in golden light, and the stars at night were brighter than he had ever seen. The work, though repetitive, gave him a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in the previous lives he had stepped into. One evening, as Oliver lit the lantern, he noticed the horizon darkening. Thunder rumbled faintly and the wind began to howl, rattling the windows. A storm was coming. Oliver's heart raced as he hurried down the stairs to check the machinery. The boiler needed more coal, and the oil reservoir was running low. He worked quickly, shoveling coal into the furnace and pouring oil into the system. Outside, the wind screamed and rain lashed against the lighthouse. Suddenly, a faint light flickered on the horizon. Oliver froze, squinting through the storm. A ship was out there, its faint lantern barely visible through the sheets of rain. "They're depending on me," Oliver whispered to himself, his hands shaking. He ran back up the stairs, checking the flame and adjusting the lantern to ensure its beam cut through the storm. Finally, just before dawn, the storm began to break. The winds calmed, and the rain softened to a drizzle. Exhausted, Oliver slumped against the wall, his legs trembling from the effort. He stared out at the ocean, searching for any sign of the ship. As the first rays of sunlight touched the sea, Oliver spotted something moving on the horizon. The ship had made it through the storm. Relief flooded him as the vessel signaled with a series of flashes from its lantern. Though he couldn't hear their words, he felt their gratitude in every pulse of light. Later that morning, as Oliver cleaned the lantern, he heard a knock at the lighthouse door. Startled, he hurried downstairs to find a sailor standing there, soaked but smiling. "I wanted to thank you," the sailor said, his voice thick with emotion. "Your light saved us last night. We'd have been lost without it." Oliver stared at the man, his chest tightening. "I was just doing my job," he said quietly. The sailor shook his head. "It's more than a job. You're the reason we're alive. Never forget that." With that, the sailor tipped his hat and disappeared into the mist. As Oliver returned to the lantern room, the golden light surrounded him once more. He closed his eyes, letting the warmth of the library envelop him. When he opened them, the silver-haired librarian was waiting. "And," she asked, her smile soft, "what did you learn this time?" "That purpose doesn't always come with applause," Oliver said. "Sometimes it's about doing the work, even when no one's watching." The librarian nodded. "Even the smallest light can guide others through the darkest storms." Oliver smiled, his heart lighter than it had been in days. "What's next?" Part 8, The Journey Home. As the golden light faded, Oliver found himself back in the familiar expanse of the library. The shelves stretched endlessly, glowing faintly in the warm light. The silver-haired librarian stood nearby, watching him with a knowing smile. "Well, Oliver," she said gently, "you've lived many lives, each with its own joys and challenges. What have you learned?" Oliver looked down at his hands, remembering the sword he had wielded as a knight, the guitar he had strummed as a star, the salves he had mixed as a healer, and the lantern he had tended as a lighthouse keeper. Each life had shown him something different, and each had left its mark on his heart. "I've learned that no life is perfect," Oliver said slowly. "Every life has its own struggles, even the ones that seem exciting or glamorous. But I've also learned that every life has meaning, whether it's helping others, creating something beautiful, or just doing your best to make the world a little brighter." The librarian nodded. "And what about your own life?" Oliver hesitated. For so long he had felt trapped in his small, ordinary life. But now, after experiencing the lives of others, he saw his world differently. His life wasn't about fame or grand adventures, but it had its own quiet beauty. His work at the bakery, the warm smiles of the customers, and the peaceful evenings under the stars. I think my life is enough," Oliver said, a small smile spreading across his face. "It's not perfect, but it's mine, and I'm ready to live it." The librarian's eyes sparkled. "Then it's time for you to go home." The librarian led Oliver to the center of the library, where a single book sat on a pedestal. Its cover was plain, but when Oliver opened it, he saw the story of his own life written on the pages. Each chapter was familiar, yet it felt richer and more meaningful now that he had lived the lessons of other lives. As he turned the final page, the golden light returned, surrounding him in its warm glow. The library began to fade, its endless shelves dissolving into the light. Oliver closed his eyes, letting the light carry him back. When he opened them again, he was standing in the quiet bookshop where it had all begun. The dusty shelves and faint smell of parchment were exactly as he remembered. The old man behind the counter smiled at him. "Find what you were looking for?" the man asked. Oliver nodded, his heart full. "I did, thank you." He handed the blank book back to the man, who took it with a knowing look. "Remember, the magic isn't in the books, it's in how you choose to live." Oliver smiled, stepping out into the fresh morning air. The town was waking up, the streets filling with familiar faces. As he walked back toward the bakery, the world around him seemed brighter. The sound of laughter, the scent of fresh bread, the warmth of the sun on his face, it all felt alive in a way it hadn't before. That night, Oliver sat by his window, looking out at the stars. He still dreamed of adventures and excitement, but he no longer felt restless. He understood now that his life was an adventure, filled with its own moments of joy and meaning. And as he drifted off to sleep, he dreamed not of escaping his life, but of living it fully, one chapter at a time.